Hello, can everyone hear me at home? I told Jane to mute her microphone. Something's not. That's microphone. Right, am I echoing? Can everyone hear me at home? Can someone wave a hand in the air or something? Great. Due to the exceptionally clunky technology at historic England, which frankly they should be ashamed of, I can share my screen with you so you can see the slides, but I'm having to tab between that screen and my notes to deliver the talk. So this might take slightly longer than normal. Thank you all for coming. I promise the poster on the right is actually real. In the event of a nuclear attack, the town hall will be moved to Southwark Entertainments. I have been faithfully promised this is real. So this is obviously quite a lot later than everything I'm talking about, which is largely a Second World War enterprise. My colleagues in the heritage team who deal with the archives and everything believe that Southwark Entertainments is the theatre below the old town hall in Camberwell. And obviously, as most of you have got through London today, and you can look out the window, you can see we have not actually suffered nuclear Armageddon. So that's a good start. Armageddon of technology, of course. Right. So I'm having to switch between slides and then change them on another window to get my notes. So this might take slightly longer than normal. And this is also not the most photogenic subject. The slides are incredibly text heavy. I've highlighted key points in red. From a search, there are remarkably few photographs of the shelter. Southwark has no photographs in our collection of the shelter in its use. Secrets of the Underground, which are somewhere on YouTube, have a video of a walk through the shelter, but it includes very little of the history and use. So until 1965, Southwark was one of 3 boroughs that make up the modern borough. So it's marked in red on the large map, and this is the parishes that make it up. So if you drive down the Old Kent Road, the borough boundary stops just after Tesco's and goes up to Lambeth in the west. Bermondsey is east and Camberwell is south. The entire life of the shelter fits within the sort of pre-1965 borough. Now, switch over, one down, change slide. It's going to get very clunky. So the main sources for the Southwark Deep Shelter are this rather short book by Peter Bancroft. This is largely based on some records held by Southwark Council in the early 1980s and some drawings which my colleagues haven't been able to track down. PCA found a remarkably large chunk of the shelter, which we'll see a bit later, as part of their excavations on 127 to 143 Borough High Street. And Guy Thomas, Carly Bauer, and Charlotte Matthews wrote an excellent report on this. You'll see a bit later what we found on this side. You can imagine my gigantic panic at this large concrete thing that looks like one of the worms from Dune that appeared on the site. There's material held at the London Archives, and obviously Southwark has all its records. There's gigantic, very nicely bound volumes of minutes from at least 2 committees during the war and a committee after the war. And these 2 very fine-looking files held at the National Archives, the wartime file with good fountain pen writing at the bottom, and behind it, the post-war file. Now, this is quite a horrible slide. So what I've done, sorry, I'm going to apologise again. There's a lot of text in this. So what I've done, I've kind of highlighted what I think are the key dates to help people understand what's going on. So German rearmament was 1935, and the first circular, so this is a British government document on air raid protection, came out in slightly later in 1935. There's probably an Act of Parliament following the ARP Act, and Southwark founded 2 different committees on air raid protection. I've not really worked out the difference between the 2 of them looking at the minutes, because it's the same people involved in both, and they appear to repeat the same decisions. But such is local government for you. So there's the Special Air Raid Precautions Committee and the Air Raid Precautions Committee. Um, the government issues a report on the ARP, or Air Raid Protection Scheme, and the problems of providing shelters, written by a chap called Mr. T.E. Scott, FRIBA. There's various beliefs that run behind this. First of all, that the warnings will be remarkably short, so you need lots of shelters. Part of the thoughts behind this is that air raids would also be quite short. So he recommends a policy of distributed shelters, which are all close together. But the key point here, and it's in bold at the bottom of the slide, is we are looking to protect people from splinters and blast damage caused by bombing. There is not a thought of protecting people from direct hits. There's an interesting range of arguments with some architects. Largely, this is focused on Finsbury Borough, where the Borough Council comes up with a scheme for shelters which it believes would offer total protection from air raids. Southwark, of course, doesn't do this. They follow Mr. T.E. Scott's recommendations. And as you can imagine, for much of the borough, this does provide a bit of an issue, as there bluntly is not a lot of spare land. We've seen the map. It's a heavy urban borough. Right, I now have to swap between slides. So, T.E. Scott is a very eminent chap. That's on the right is his obituary in the RIBA journal. So he's chair of the RIBA. Now, part of the reason for only protecting people from blast and shrapnel is simply the time taken to deal with this and the belief that the war would happen. Everything appears quite fatalistic. The other key point, which is something that didn't actually come to my mind, but doing the search for this, there's a very slim volume written after the Second World War about the structural engineering of bomb shelters. And before the war, no one really had any idea how to do this. And there's lots of failures and lots of efforts. And this is also, I feel, part of the reason why no one had any real theory about trying to provide protection outside Finsbury. So Scott is quite conservative and receives quite a lot of criticism in the architectural profession. Right. I'll have to shuffle down again. Now, so the 17th of March, 1939, I feel this decision follows the German invasion of Czechoslovakia from the Special Air Raid Precautions Committee minutes, not the Air Raid Precautions Committee minutes, the special one. There is a great consideration of dispersed shelters, and they've realised that this is very difficult in an urban situation. There's not the free land and the difficulty of strengthening buildings whilst the buildings are in use, rather than making new provision, is an equal problem. Even if you walk around the centre of Southwark today, up and down Borough High Street, there is simply remarkably little free land. There's a lot of buildings that aren't really in use that could probably, something could probably be done with, but there is not a lot of free land. So this is kind of what's happening at the start of 1939 when everything is looking a bit hopeless. More text for you all. Now, the first idea to use the disused tube line, I'll talk more about exactly what the tube line is slightly later on, comes from Regis House in the city. So they write to the chap I've circled in red at the bottom there on the bottom left, Frank Pick, who is the head of the London Transport Board, who I will probably, simply because it's fixed in my mind, refer to as TfL all the way through this. So there's some discussion at the London Transport Board about the shelters, and then it's recognised that the majority of this tube line is in Southwark. So the disused tube line, the South London Railway, was originally built to run from Borough Tube Station to King William Street, so under Regis House. It was a narrow twin-board railway that fell out of use remarkably quickly because, as we'll see slightly later on, the trains are really horrible and small. So This is something a little bit about Frank Pick. Probably all of you have recognised his name, and you can imagine the time it took me to try and get a clear photograph of his memorial in Piccadilly Circus Station without a load of tourists wandering in front of it. I was there for quite a while. Um, so the key issue for London transport, and this goes back to the idea that shelters are built to only protect people from blast and shrapnel. If I lived in Southwark and I was being offered from protection from blast and shrapnel, I'd be buying a return ticket and sitting at the bottom of Borough Tube Station, quite a lot of this, and trying to prevent, and this is likely to obviously prevent the operation of the underground. Um, so the London Transport Board have a key objective of keeping people out of the tube system who are looking to shelter from bombs. Because compared with sitting in a soggy trench for an Anderson shelter, almost any tube station is a far more attractive place to go. So I think this is one of the key reasons why the London Transport Board and Frank Pick identified these two disused tube tunnels and sent the information through to Southwark. Now, something else I've got here to keep an eye on. I have a lot of numbers here. I have highlighted them in yellow. So keep an eye out for these. Thank you. Yes, you could steer a pointer across them, Jane. You'll see a lot of changing numbers here as we go through this. So this 14,000 people comes from the memorial plaque on Borough Tube Station. So what these two maps show is the location of the tube station under Regis House. I've circled it in red, and on the bottom right is the tube station at Borough Tube Station, circled in blue. So these are the two sorts of stairwell shafts and lifts that are still useful at Borough Tube Station for actually giving you access to the tube system. Now, as I said, this is the first deep board tube line in London, and its first phase from Borough Tube Station to King William Street. This was later extended out to Stockwell in the north with later developments. Now, sorry, I'm shuffling backwards and forwards. So this is Borough Tube Station in 1955. Subject to a little bit of bomb damage, this is pretty well the pre-war tube building. So this was rebuilt in 1922 as part of the works for the expanded Northern Line tunnels. So the photograph of the train you can see there, this is the train which runs through these two disused tube lines which run under Borough High Street. There's a drawing of the interior, top right. So as you can see, there's effectively a very narrow gun slot window before the curve of the roof behind the backs of the seats. This is a far, far smaller system than any of the modern tubes. Originally, this system was designed, it was for such a short route, it was designed for a fixed engine to pull the trains through on a rope. So the tube tunnel under the river is built with some sort of quite tall rises and falls. But of course, that technology didn't survive until it was opened. And instead of the fixed engines to pull the system through, this is the first electric tube line with electric engines, which in a number of occasions were powerful enough to actually deal with the inclines. So they used to have to take a bit of a run up to get up the river. I can't honestly think of anything worse. But anyway, this system lasted for 10 years before the new Northern Line, I say new Northern Line, obviously it's quite old, was put in. Right. So some of you don't recognise this diagram from a nice volume called Big Dig, which I was given a copy of when I was doing a master's at Durham, and someone who was working on the Jubilee line came to talk to us. So what we have here is a view of the Jubilee line entrance on Borough High Street on the left, and this really wonderful diagram showing where the Roman buildings were excavated under Borough High Street with the tube system behind it. So if we look down, we see the Roman material and the ticket office, and below there I have circled two small tubes. Those are the two disused tunnels from the King William Street Railway. Below that are the three larger tunnels of the Northern Line we use today. And below that, I don't really think this is a very good proportional diagram, are the absolutely gigantic tunnels of the Jubilee Line that looks to have trains about 3 times the size as the Northern Line. But that gives you an idea. So these tunnels still survive, and they are above the current Northern Line, but disused. More horrible text. So, in September 1938, gates and walls were constructed to prevent the river breaching tube lines and flooding. So this included the work on the King William Street Railway. As you've seen, this is above the current Northern Line. So obviously, if this was breached, flooded by the river, there's a chance it would have actually flooded down into the Northern Line. Now, this is obviously quite a key point, as it means this is useful. It looks as if some of the works to sort of close this system off from the river were improved as part of the works on the shelter, but broadly that established a length of tube that's usable, safe, and with access tunnels accessible. The bits you probably can't see in these, there is a huge debate about whether this is a useful shelter to build and why other things haven't happened. So this is a national organisation criticising the borough for trying to do something quite difficult. And it looks like the borough engineer was having a bit of a hard time. So hopefully you can read that very small bit of text for a change rather than the gigantic text there. So this is a note from the Home Office. The borough engineer has not exercised much ingenuity in his search for public shelters. So the map in the background, all of us have probably seen, is a Goad Insurance map. But it's quite useful in showing the extent of stuff that's actually underground in North Southwark. So quite a number of arches in Bermondsey. Bermondsey in this case is the stuff immediately left of, immediately to the right of Borough High Street, obviously outside Southwark. These arches are still there. They now have a few holes poked through them to support the Thameslink viaduct that was dug through there. So the basements owned by Lyon and Co. are pretty well bang on where the current underground box is off Tooley Street and Duke Street Hill. Trenches in Southwark Cathedral Churchyard. Mm. I hear disapproval from a very informed voice behind me. And I have to admit, I have been in that cellar in Borough Market that the last point is poked to, and I don't believe that would withstand anything. It was the thinnest skim, and to be honest, I think a lot of it was strengthened and infilled as part of the Thameslink works. So I don't think this is particularly realistic, but certainly fits in with our expectation of blast and shrapnel protection. So those are really the alternatives. Right, yeah, you might need to do it by pointing here. So we're now on 1st of November 1939, so we're still pretty early in the war. So this is the Air Raid Precautions Committee, not the Special Air Raid Precautions Committee minutes. So 2 shelters are planned, one at Grotto Place and one at Merrick Square. Merrick Square would obviously be quite an interesting one, as this is right bang in the middle of the Roman burial ground, so and is one of our most undisturbed bits of land in that Roman burial ground, so we're quite lucky it hasn't gone. But you can see the problem here. So I've drawn in blue on here the area that was later employed to be the deep shelter. If you could point at that, please. So basically, it runs from almost the end of London Bridge right the way down to nearly Borough Tube Station, right through the accessible part of the borough. If we wind back to what Mr. D.E. Scott was saying before the war kicked off, 2 minutes access. It's about a mile from London Bridge Station down to Merrick Square. You know, none of this is particularly possible, but most of the objections and discussions that come from central government are the cost. I have again highlighted a number in yellow for you. So if it's 6,000 people, this is £8.33 a head to provide 8 entrances at £5,000 each and £10,000 to fit the shelter up. So Grotto Place, £30 a head, and Merrick Square, £29 a head. So pretty good value, very good protection, centrally located. What more do you want? So much of the shelter was planned and designed by Mr. David Anderson of the organisation Mott, Hay and Anderson, who are now called Mott MacDonald or Mott or something, depending on when they've recently changed their name. I don't know if any of their archaeologists are listening. I did give them a poke, and I also asked a few questions if they had anything nice hidden in their archive, but they don't appear to have one. So this is one of the very early plans of the shelter. If you could please direct your pointer to the far left. Um, the original plan, as I said, was for 8 entrances, but 9 are kind of planned. So one is coming off the south side of London Bridge, exactly where your pointer is. Thank you very much, Jane. It's difficult to see how this would have been accessed. Obviously, this is the 1832 bridge, which has since been replaced, but looks immensely inconvenient. And if you're looking for something that's not going to flood, putting an entrance bang next to the river, to my eye, doesn't strike me as a particularly good idea. If we could move to the pink line by the cathedral. So obviously this is going to have cut through a decent chunk of Southwark Cathedral's burial ground. This entrance was discontinued as there was worry that it would actually destabilize the cathedral and undermine its foundations. So that's 2 off. One is from London Bridge Station, which was built. And then there's several others as we go further down. We'll talk a bit more about them later. But there's issues with a number of them. So the entrances that are built are listed out there. So the Marlborough Playground, this is in the middle of the south side, middle of the bottom of the drawing, the pink line. That was built. St Margaret's Court, and then 3 along the north side, and the final entrance at St George the Martyr Church, right on the right-hand side. Again, far too many drawings for you. So the final costs were issued in May 1941, and unsurprisingly, it had nearly doubled in value. So there's notes. So the first entrance to be built was in the Marble Playground. This was a completely open area and it could just be excavated straight down. Something to remember that causes a lot of interesting issues later is obviously all these works were done under Second World War Powers Acts, so they could tunnel from the Marble Playground under freehold buildings onto Borough High Street to connect up with the tube line under Borough High Street. This is something that happens a lot later on and issues some steps. So the Southwark Cathedral entrance was abandoned. A different route was proposed, which would have cost £13,000, so that was discontinued quite quickly. The London Bridge Steps entrance was discontinued. An entrance was proposed from Southwark Street, which would have been more sensible, but it turned out there was a high pressure water main in the way when they started work. And there's another entrance on some of these later notes for St Thomas Street, which I've not actually identified in any of the earlier drawings. So St Thomas Street is obviously south of London Bridge Station. There's not really an obvious location for it, even on the early maps. But as I said, 6 entrances were progressed, 2 on the west, 4 on the east. So London Bridge Station, I've got them listed out somewhere else, sorry. London Bridge Station, the George, 143 Borough High Street, St George the Martyr, St Margaret's Court, and the Marble Playground on the south side. And here we are. So I've put the text of the news story on the left-hand side here. 11,000 people. And this is the entrance in the Marble Playground. One thing to note is it does not have a blast wall in front of the door. These were added later on. But as far as I've been able to identify, no matter how varying the numbers are, this does appear to be the single largest shelter built in Britain for civilians during the Second World War. The numbers vary a lot. So we've had 14,000, 6,000, and now we're on 11,000. There are other numbers later on. So here are some more numbers. So on the left-hand side, there's a letter effectively criticising quite a lot of the shelter provision. So the number of beds within the shelter is 3,222, but the total sort of capacity with people sleeping on the floor is 4,300. So one point I made earlier, based on the T.E. Scott material, there was a belief that there'd be a very short warning for air raids, and air raids wouldn't last too long. But obviously, that isn't actually how things worked. Air raids used to last a lot longer than people thought. So people, especially early in the war, were having to spend a long time in air raid shelters. So if you have an Anderson shelter in your garden and it's kind of not very nice like it is today, effectively you're sat in a damp trench with a bit of crinkly tin over your head, buried under some soil, and you're having to spend all night in that. That's not particularly attractive. And it's only protecting you from blast and shrapnel. It's not actually doing anything for a direct hit. Um, are people really going to take that risk in this kind of weather? A couple of hours? Yeah, fine. All night? Really not very nice. Um, and this long-term use of shelters is something that developed later on in the war, but wasn't really predicted to start off with. So bunk capacity and total capacity is really quite a key element. The really faint and very difficult to see drawing on the right-hand side, if Jane could please steer herself towards the bottom right-hand corner. Thank you. This is the setup using the two tunnels for Southwark Council to run everything from the shelter if it needed to. So there's a whole series of bunks, meeting rooms, and the bit where I asked Jane to put her pointer, which she just moved off, is housed all the council records. So these records survived for Southwark, but they were lost for Bermondsey when the town hall was bombed in Bermondsey. So here we are. So the council records, including minutes from these two committees, spent their time in a bomb shelter. Right, so here are some points from the drawings to help you see. So the facilities in the shelter are pretty limited. So there's toilets and canteens, the borough control room at the south end, and what's marked on these is ejectors. So these are sewage tanks that fill up from the toilets and are then pumped out up into the sewage system above here. As well as all these facilities, obviously the air needs to be changed. So with 6 entrances, 3 had fans to bring air in and 3 had fans to take air out. We'll see more detail of this later on as one of the sites turned up during an excavation with the surviving fan system. So as you can see, it is particularly cramped and very difficult to use. And a lot of this caused quite a few issues. As part of the minutes, not from the special committee, from the shelter committee, there's a lot of detail about how the shelter operated. Something that comes up, I've taken a selection of some of the numerous issues that happened. So there's people smoking. So it seems quite advanced, really, that people aren't allowed to smoke in the 1940s in the shelter. I have to admit that struck me as quite odd. Mowbray Buildings, which is a tenement that's been lost since the Second World War, shows up on innumerable occasions. I think they were doing a swift business in giving people addresses in Southwark so they could get shelter tickets and then go and live in the shelter. It pops up later on with someone else, but you know, Mr. Mitchell's obviously having quite a good time running around the place down there. And again, you know, not walking too far to the toilets is probably the polite way of dealing with this. That does seem to be a reasonably frequent occurrence. So the toilets, as we're dealing with quite a small tunnel, they're described as only having a curtain in front of the toilet pan rather than a door. So there is really no privacy here. And 42 toilets of each type between 4,300 people based on the lowest number. So sort of managing the shelter was largely done by issuing tickets to residents. And the tickets were called in and reissued every so often during the war to ensure they were going to residents. Um, it does seem that somebody there's a lot of discussion of this in the minutes. Some people were basically getting on motorbikes as soon as there was an air raid siren and travelling up from Peckham or Nunhead to use the shelter in Southwark, obviously coming from Camberwell Borough. Um, and obviously there's other people who appeared not to actually be homeless, who again have a deal with Mowbray buildings, but as they don't have furniture there, they're judged to be indigent and they're not given a ticket to come into the shelter, which strikes me as really quite appalling. Um, Obviously at this time we're still dealing with a society of workhouses. So how this works, I don't know, but there's a lot of call for this. If you don't have an address, you don't have furniture, you're not considered to be able to get a ticket. So it's really quite a severe issue. But sort of every year, every 6 months or so, the tickets were all called in and reissued to residents. And lots of issues along these lines were identified. And we have someone else as well. Um, they didn't report what the language was, which I thought was a bit of a shame. Um, but yeah, and obviously Patsy Stapleton could well be alive. I'm going to have a look on Ancestry and see if I can track them down at some point. Because this is 1944 and they're 8. So they could well still be alive. Um, but you imagine this is just some of the many, many issues that happened with so many people in the shelter at one time. Um, One point that did surprise me somewhat reading all the minutes is for much of the war, half of the shelter was closed off. We have two bored tunnels that run parallel to each other. And for about 2 years during the war, the western half was closed off simply because the fall in bombing raids and I assume just confidence and just getting used to the potential risk. Fewer people were going into the shelter. Obviously, once doodle bugs and V2 rockets and everything else starts, then the whole of the shelter is reopened because obviously they're really quite a serious issue, um, and a totally different, a totally different things to react to rather than a bombing raid. Um, but it's one of the points that was a bit of a surprise during this, right? So we are now at 1945, so we're getting on to nuclear doom. So, VE Day was the 8th of May, and works start on closing the shelter on the 14th of May to secure the building and ensure everyone's out. But obviously, we are dealing with something with 3,022 beds. And evacuees and people returning home, the whole thing is potentially quite useful in that sense. Um, but everything kind of goes silent. So Southwark retains ownership of the entrances. The War Powers Acts continue through the 40s into the early 50s. And then we come on to another stream of text in a minute. So this is the bomb damage map. I've circled where the entrances are. So top right on that clear patch, that's in front of London Bridge Station, that's Denham Street. No damage. The buildings and structures aren't recorded on the bomb damage map for access here. The next one, down Borough High Street, which has got thank you. That is the entrance at the George, so that's 79 Borough High Street with red. Over the other side of the road, St Margaret's Court. Some of the buildings, some of the hot warehouses behind it have received some damage, but that entrance is currently undamaged. So back over the other side of Borough High Street, down slightly, 75, 73, 75 Borough High Street, those buildings survived with very little change until after 2012. And back over the road, we have the Marble Playground. Obviously, this is the entrance I showed in the picture in the news reports, which is in completely open land. Now, over on the right, to try and fit this map on the page a bit better, I cut the section out with St George the Martyr Church on. So I believe this purple building is the entrance from the side of St George the Martyr Church, which has received some damage, but as the letter from the rector in 1949 suggests, there's quite a lot of this still standing. So Mosers were located in the building the other side of Borough High Street, so the Brandon House opposite Borough Tube Station, which is marked in red with a purple background on it on this map. So presumably they had a reasonable view of what was going on up against the blast wall. The entrance was from the north side on Tabard Street. So we'll see a bit more of what survives at St George the Martyr later. So everything's still standing into the late 1940s. But we have this rather excellent photo I took when I was doing some research on the early nuclear stuff at Sellafield in another job. So I think there's some key points that are going on here. So the blockade of Berlin by the Soviet Union inspires NATO and is kind of one of the key elements in the start of the Cold War. There's then various tests of hydrogen bombs, and in 1957 there's a fire at Windscale, now Sellafield, and if this new nuclear power station had been built, it would have been called Moorside. You've always got to change the name. Destroyed one of two graphite reactors that were built to supply Britain's efforts at building a hydrogen bomb. So if you look at the tall grey tower with the black top, it's kind of sort of slightly sloping out a bit. This is the surviving graphite reactor of the two. So yeah, just happened to use my own camera for that rather than the one I was told I had to use for all the photography. But there we are, always useful. So the Civil Defence Committee starts, again, just one Civil Defence Committee, not a special one, and a Civic Defence Committee. Yeah, that's the same slide. Starts in 1951. So the borough engineer goes to check the shelter. So at this point, the shelter is still under the control of the council through various War Powers Acts. The War Powers Acts all have a time limit on them, and this is a major point for the use of the shelter. The other point I will recommend here is Southwark Council is believing this is going to be a civilian shelter and is actually going to be useful for to protect the population. Now, there is an amazing book by Peter Hennessy called The Secret State, which is about the sort of operation of Britain's nuclear defences and the reaction to them in the post-war period. Some of it is just crazy. Absolutely crazy. So in the 1960s, the Prime Minister, if they needed to get the bombs going, would have been driven around, had to have phoned the operator and said, I am the Prime Minister, to get the Vulcan bombers in the air. None of this nuclear suitcase with a button or anything like that. And just this belief that everything would just work. So the key point to maintain access to the shelter is land ownership. Now, I've mentioned there's remarkably little in the Southwark Civil Defence Committee minutes on the shelter after these initial checks. The shelter is kind of taken out of the hands of the council, except for the entrance to St George the Martyr Church. And the government takes over negotiations to try and maintain the shelter and keep access to it. And the bulk of this file on the right-hand side are are studies of the shelter and how various engineers believe it would react to the size of different explosions, and plans for leases with the London Transport Board to keep access to the two twin-board tunnels, and negotiations over the property to gain access to the shelter and secure the entrances. So TfL initially, sorry, London Transport Board, I said I'm going to use TfL quite a lot, initially offer a 21-year lease from 1952 to the government for using the two disused tube lines as a bomb shelter for £100 a year. Obviously, this only gives the two tube lines. It doesn't provide any of the accesses. So the two accesses on the west. So these are St Margaret's Court and the Marlborough Playground. Both of these are dug and they go under freehold properties to get to the tube line, get to the disused tube line. So you've got to negotiate the land the entrance is on, and you've got to negotiate the subsoil rights under the freehold properties lining Borough High Street to secure access through the staircases that have been built. Oh my God, you would not believe how many notes there are over the civil service about doing this. So effectively, those two entrances are considered too difficult to negotiate over the detail of the subsoil rights and preventing development of buildings fronting onto Borough High Street. So they're given up. So this leaves four entrances. So George the Martyr is retained by the council. There's then a whole load of legal shenanigans is the only way to put this. So obviously, this is before the 1981 Disused Burial Grounds Amendment Act, which means in 1981, the law was changed. So you could build things other than a church in a disused burial ground. There's a very fun opinion, legal opinion, that either the entrance that's currently in St George the Martyr built under the War Powers Act would require a faculty, but it would not be legal to issue a faculty for its construction as it is not a church. So there's a recommendation in 1955 to pass an Act of Parliament to secure that access and the freehold rights under some of the other entrances. Now, if we go to the east side of Borough High Street, the entrance from London Bridge Station is under one property. It goes under the road, no issue. The entrance in front of the George circles under the building. The National Trust want £50 a year for the rights to keep the staircase going. A bargain at half the price, I feel. Very reasonable people. They want £50 a year, so that's reasonably easy to secure. And the entrance at 145 Borough High Street, again, it starts under the building, curves around and goes back under. That land is in the ownership of British Rail, so it's kind of a bit easier for the government to do a deal over. And then, of course, nuclear technology changes. Here are some of the very horrible texts here, which discuss how the shelter would react to different sizes of bombs. So this is examined all the way through the 50s and exactly what would need to happen. So a £500 bomb, everyone's pretty confident about. A £1,000 bomb, they're getting a bit more nervous of. Anything larger than that brings up a whole range of different issues. Not least the reaction of any river defences to a nuclear explosion in the river. You can see all the problems here, can't you? So, as well as the legal negotiations to gain control of the access, there's significant concerns about how to stop the tunnel flooding if there's an atomic explosion. I'm using the phrase atomic rather than a hydrogen bomb, because obviously once the hydrogen bomb comes out, it's an entirely different world. So there's kind of a belief that you then have to give up a very large section of the tunnel towards the river, which would bring the London Bridge Station entrance out of use. and give up the end of the tunnel towards Borough Tube Station, where the tube line starts to rise, as it wouldn't offer you the atomic protection. So you're then looking at a far shorter section with only two entrances that you can get access to. Um, if you're then going to design a bomb shelter, which is going to enable the accesses to be used, if a bomb is dropped in the river, the flood defences go, and at high tide, Southwark is flooded, then you have to raise the entrances up. So you'd have to demolish the buildings which are over the current entrance, put a raised entrance in there, and all this is going to be a bit obvious, because as I've mentioned, the shelter is taken out of the control of the council. It stops being, once the government get their hands on it, there stops being any idea that this is going to be a civilian shelter. You know, right in a very busy high street in South London. Now, I'm imagining if everyone had an idea that there were some Soviet bombers on their way over, there'd be a bit of a disagreement about the public not being allowed in there in an area like this. Um, so it's very difficult to see how this continued, but this sort of negotiation of land rights, nuclear technology changing, and just general madness is about the only way of looking at it, continued until July 1959, when the file was closed. Oh, I haven't used the screen on, sorry. When the file was closed. But this went on for 6 years longer than very good evidence that hydrogen bombs were remarkably effective things. So I've put this letter from 1954 on the side. So Mr. Greetham is a structural engineer at the Ministry of Works, and he appears to have real ambitions. He is the person writing lots of reports in this file that say, yeah, it'll be fine. It'll still work. It'll be fine. Whilst all the other technology is going on in the background, he's kind of not really looking at the bomb sizes. It's a very strange, it's a very strange thing. So, hmm. Yeah, but he issues, in his letter here, he's discussing the bulkheads and the river and what happens if it's flooded. Because obviously, if this tunnel floods, then the Northern Line will flood below it as well. Um, it's a really strange file, this one. There's no other way of putting it. I mean, but just the weirdness and paranoia that must be going through everyone's minds, and then realizing that you can't get a faculty for a bomb shelter entrance. Um, it sounds, it just sounds remarkable. So the shelter is given up. So this is one of a series of drawings held by TfL. So this is a section through the staircase from the marble playground down to the two tube lines on the side. So you can see the length of the tunnel and the rises and the falls in this staircase to get down there. This is quite a remarkable piece of engineering. So the staircase tunnel is large enough, so sort of, two people could have walked down at the same time, shoulder to shoulder. They had a central railing to help everyone get there, but you can kind of see the level of engineering that's gone on here with the rises and the falls to get back. And you can also see how high it would be towards Borough High Street as it drops down into the centre. So there's a bit of an issue with building over it. So the top and bottoms of the tunnels are plugged to separate them from the two tube lines. And there's various plugs put in, which is the slightly darker shading you can see, which is more solid concrete. And then the rest of the tunnel is the rest of these sort of stair shafts. The tunnel's left open. These stair shafts are filled with a very loose, weak mix concrete. The theory being that if water comes in, then the concrete will react and it'll all solidify and hold the thing together. So this is TfL's efforts, or sorry, London Transport Board's efforts, to get around the issue of the tunnels being abandoned, the staircases being abandoned, but potentially being a void under somebody else's freehold land. So this is how it is left. And this is what we seem to find nowadays. So this is the St Margaret's Court access that Some of you will have heard various people talk about Landmark Court, where we have some rather lovely Roman material. Didn't have any under this because there's a dirty great tunnel running through it. Um, so what you can see there with my very large purple arrow is we have the concrete box at the start of the tunnel, which has been broken open to sort of close the end of the tunnel off. And then just behind the left-hand end of the arrow, we have the start of the fall of the staircase. And then where I'm standing, there's another concrete box where the tunnel's been broken open again and it's been closed off and sealed and separated from the rest of the staircase. The diagram on the left-hand side shows this staircase doesn't run fully under the alleyway of St Margaret's Court, but has been filled in under the various buildings to prevent any movement. And then drops down into the centre of Borough High Street. It's always quite fun seeing the chap from Hunt's Groundworkers' face when he first saw this and going, what on earth is it? Because what you're seeing, you're in that picture, you're seeing about half the width of the staircase tunnel. And this one's been played with and encased in concrete, so it looks slightly different from the construction that we have had elsewhere. So this is 143, 145 Borough High Street. So as part of the works for the Olympics, these buildings, which had kind of been abandoned on the left-hand side, and they had a scaffold running across Borough High Street. It's the ones with the white entrance, that's it. The ones with the sort of white square entrance. This is 143, 145. These had basically largely been abandoned. 143 had a shop in it. 145 had nothing in it since the Second World War because it had the tube entrance under it. So that square entrance there, just at the bottom, thank you. That is the shelter entrance, and that was standing open on that was standing as a feature of Borough High Street until about 2015, which I feel is quite remarkable. So the next photo along, this is from PCA's building recording report on the site. This is standing at the back of the building, looking towards the front of the building. So this slope and steel, the steel are part of the works to strip what was scaffolding supporting the front of this building off, but that slope you can see running up, that is the top of the staircase going down into the shelter. So quite annoyingly, the bottom bit of the zoom stuff is cutting over the drawing here. So this is a mock talus view from the Survey of London volume. And if we could see the bottom of it, you'd see this sort of fake view, fake elevation drawing of Borough High Street had the entrance on it for 145. But what you can see is the other circle which Jane is going towards. That is the entrance further up Borough High Street that we'll be having a look at in a minute.
Can I say, if you click on those three dots that say more, it might say hide mission control is one of the options. No, sorry. Worth a try.
But if you have a look at the Survey of London volume, it's all available online at britishhistoryonline.org.uk or some British History Online. You were able to see this elevation. So I mentioned a certain sci-fi film.
The original.
Yeah, okay. Imagine the look on Dougie from PCA's face when that turned up on his site. And he then found himself excavating Roman archaeology above the segmented concrete tunnel. So that section with the segments on is part of the original build of the staircase. So the staircases were constructed using an air pressure system and various early forms of bentonite, I suppose, which effectively is sealing the sand and gravel around it to enable the air pressure system to sort of blow a cutting edge down, and then a concrete ring system was formed beyond that. So that is part of the original tunnel here. You can see where the blue modern compressor is and the machine. You can see where the tunnel's been broken just to the right-hand side. And a concrete box put in there, which again is shown on the drawing far on the right-hand side. So I've circled the bits where you can see the staircase tunnel start to drop off. So yeah, that was a bit of a shock. Every so often PCA phone me up and say, oh, you're going to be surprised by this. And I was very surprised by that. Because what on earth was it? So on this site, we had a chunk of the entrance surviving. We had a chunk that had been taken out, and then the rest of this tunnel. So when this turned up, we've been told there was an air raid shelter, assuming that was the building, not the entrance to all of this. So yeah, quite an interesting one. And those of you who know Dougie will imagine his reaction quite carefully. So at the front of the site, so again, this is in the building I showed with the slope. So this is below the staircase. If you look to the right hand, sort of kind of the middle of the first photo on the left, you can see the edges of the stairs. And below that, there is this extract fan. So this is one of the extracts pumping out to encourage air change within the shelter. So the staircases were built in circular tunnels that drop down. So the stairs are obviously bridging across, and there's a space below the stairs that was used to extract air. So this was pulling air out. Other fans were blowing air in. In the descriptions for the construction of the tunnels and staircases, the intake fans are described as being 30-foot high. I've not found any illustrations of them anywhere. So presumably that's 30 foot above the entrance. So even the news reports, there's some other news reports, but they all have that one photo of the entrance in Marble Yard. So presumably that was added to that, or it's kind of hidden slightly from view. But logically, it could only really have gone straight down the staircase or under the staircase as an air intake to encourage air change. So that was quite a good piece of survival there. And someone else in the room is going to star in some of the photos soon, just to warn you all. So this is St. George the Martyr. So again, we've got the closure drawing there. So my current theory, and this works for, there's a landscape drawing held at the London Metropolitan Archive. So we've got the gate. I've got a purple arrow with blast wall on it. So the blast wall is back behind the gate. So the entrance would have been through that section that's still very clearly been rebuilt on the left-hand side. It would have gone through behind the blast wall and then dropped down in the staircase there. And again, you can see what elements are being closed off to within the graveyard. And then there's a landscaping scheme after this. So hopefully the rector, at least later on in the 1950s, had fewer complaints about people using his blast wall for things it wasn't intended for. Now, every so often a book comes out and you think, ooh, have they actually noticed the really obvious thing in the pub? Which even if you go and ask the bar staff, they will say, oh yeah, do you want to see the air raid shelter? No, he didn't. I was very pleased by that. So on the left-hand side, we have two drawings. So at the bottom, where it says section BB for the person who's steering the mouse, this is below part of the cellars of the George Public House. So what you can see along the top of that section is a whole series of iron bars to support a roof. And you can see where the section line is marked on the right-hand side of the drawing. So what we have, so on the right-hand side of that drawing, just behind the book, we have the staircase dropping from Borough High Street. There's then a landing, which runs across, and then it drops again down to the shelter level. So this would have been worth 50 quid a year for the National Trust. And as part of the sealing up works, there were two brick walls that are shown with the diagonal lines. And the area between those walls where there's a lot of writing, if you're steering your mouse still, this is open and is accessible from the George. Matt, you're about to be famous again. So this is a survey from the National Trust done by Archaeology South East. And the cellars we're talking about are shown on the right-hand side. So it's room 12 and room 13. Now, it's very unfair of me to suggest that Archaeology Southeast didn't see the trapdoor in room 13, which gets you down the staircase shown in the photograph on the right-hand side. So what I would ask you to have a look at here is the brickwork on the left-hand side of the photograph, that large piece of concrete that was shown in the plan, and the iron bars in the roof to support the roof. This is part of one of the landings of the staircase to get down into the shelter. So where Nat and the barman chap are looking, they're looking at the wall, which has been built to stop you going down the staircase into the tunnels under Borough High Street. So
That sounded
stairs. So here's just a couple of other really quite terrible photos that didn't come out very well. But this is really quite a remarkable survival. This is, as far as I can tell, it's the only accessible part of the shelter stair system that's left. I have to move on to my notes on this thing, sorry. No, I've got no notes on this page. Obviously, there's not a lot to see. Literally, it is this. So please don't go and bother the George to go into there. It's a very, very busy pub, and there really isn't a lot to see. And as you can see, that is a horrible staircase to climb up and down. But this is quite a remarkable survival and very well looked after by our colleagues at the National Trust. It's clear if you go online and have a look that much of the shelter is still quite accessible. There's a YouTube video of people walking through the tube line. And I know engineers who've been down there who are working on the Jubilee line, so it's still available and people do seemingly get in there, whether they want to or not. I think the entrance is in front of the Shard. There's a sort of circular thing. I think that is the entrance, and I think there's an entrance from Borough Tube Station, and I think there's another entrance from London Bridge Station. But obviously, who knows? Who knows how you do these things nowadays? But anyway, thank you very much. I hope this has not been too random.
I think that was delightfully random. I think that's possibly one of the most random Manus lectures I've ever been to, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Right, do we have some questions in the room whilst I see if we have questions? Oh, we've got clapping coming from online.
Yeah,
But yeah,
contact lenses have wandered off.
Questions in the room.
Not so much a question, more a comment. When you were saying you wanted to find out if it was Patsy.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could try the 1939. It wasn't actually a census, but it was like a census. To
Oh, yeah.
Started.
I have to admit, I was going to see if they're still alive.
Don't interview them.
Yeah, because I've not managed. I've spoken about this to the Southwark pensioners, but none of them, you know, my mother's 79. She was born in 1945. None of them are old enough to remember the shelter, so it's kind of trying to track anyone down, which would kind of be the interesting thing, just so you can get some idea about it. Sorry, I have a wandering contact lens, so I hope I don't blink it out. Is it a hand up? I can't read these things anymore.
There's a hand up, but I'm not sure if that's a hand or a clapping. Any more questions in the room?
Talk about the ventilation system.
Yeah.
Some gas precautions, you know, they're just pumping air through.
They were just pumping air through. There doesn't seem to be any particular gas precautions. There's a mention of gas curtains on one of the entrances, but how effective that would have been when you would need a large volume of air change to keep that building going. There are some complaints in one of the summers that mosquitoes are generating within it, which must be really awful. And this is largely during, you see, if I remember correctly, that's during the middle part of the war when the western tunnel is out of use and the mosquitoes seem to be coming in there.
Yeah, they'll let their masks with them, I suppose.
Did you say that the air intakes were 30 foot?
They're meant to be 30 foot up, yeah.
That's probably a gas.
Yes, again, yeah.
Gas is heavier than it.
Yeah. That's okay. So the Church of England and a number of other religions have the ability to give themselves planning permission for various things. So this is largely so they can do the God stuff uninterrupted by the state. So effectively, it's a planning permission, but from the church because it's in consecrated land.
Thank you.
And there is a debate about the extent to which things are God stuff, because obviously you're allowed to do non-God stuff on consecrated land nowadays.
And if anyone's interested, the Law Commission are looking to reform burial law at the moment, and the consultation is open until January the 9th.
Thank you. You can have the hand up.
Who's the owner of the shelter now?
The two tube tunnels,
Yeah.
TfL,
And
because they still have to maintain it because the Northern Line is under it. So if there's any problems with it, then the Northern Line's going to have issues.
And then when was it decommissioned as a MOD or?
Well, again, the property shenanigans are such that TfL or the London Transport Board retained ownership, and they were issuing various leases of it, but the lease was never signed after the war for it to remain in use as a shelter. So Southwark had access to it by agreement and through various war powers acts during the First World War, Second World War, and then the powers from these acts were time limited, and they ran out.
Yeah, he's 21 years.
Yeah. So there's a 21-year lease issued that was never signed in 1952 because they couldn't sign the lease because they weren't sure about access, because the lease only covered the two board tunnels.
Any more questions in the room? We have no questions online.
Is anyone still there?
So there are 42 people still there.
Oh, crikey.
Harvey, hang on, here's Jill. Jill, thank you. Chris, any evidence of canteens for communal catering or tea making in the tunnels?
Yes.
Yes.
I think I put that. I think I said that at the.
I saw canteen on a map.
There's at least 2 canteens on the map. There's an effort by some bunch of evangelical churches to get their hands on the canteen, presumably so they could kind of encourage membership while people are trapped underground with them and needing tea.
Thanks, Jill. Right, Harvey, are you still there?
I'm still there, yes, indeed.
Harvey,
Can you-
fantastic.
Well, Chris, thank you very much.
Harvey, I think we've reached a natural end of the questions. So if you would like to,
Yep, I'm there.
if you would like to thank our speaker and close the evening, Harvey, that would be fabulous.
Okay, can you hear me?
Except you're on mute.
Okay.
Can
Chris,
you
thank
unmute,
you.
Harvey?
Can you hear me, Chris? When?